In the meantime, I'll change the name to Ward. Okay, and Ward, please begin.
Well, I've been here before, as have many of those participating on our side. I hate to think of things in terms of our side plus or theirs, but such is as it is. When 209 was being considered by the voters of California, many of us, and I think the voters agreed with that, felt that the time had essentially run out on using affirmative action as a device to divide the people of this state. If that was the case in 1996, it is certainly the case now. We sometimes forget that the country that we live in really values the principle of equal citizenship. Lincoln talked about this in Gettysburg as a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That has been driven into the fiber of the American people in ways that no one could have imagined when I was born in 1939. But we do believe in equal citizenship. Equality drives our economy, it drives our public policy, it's in our Constitution. We are a nation that believes in the principle that everybody should be treated equally. The issue that is before us now, brought by Proposition 16, is less about equal citizenship than it is about equity and about redistributing wealth and power. If you look at the voter's guide, you will see that the proponents of Proposition 16 talk about representation and white men having too much wealth and power. And their proposal, one can clearly understand, is to redistribute the wealth and power in America, to make sure that there is essentially equal representation at our colleges, especially San Diego and Los Angeles and Berkeley. And while we might applaud that objective, the reality is that we're playing with fire. Black people aren't asking for race preferences to be restored. It's those in the legislature and elsewhere who are fewer in number, significantly fewer in number than those who are opposing this. We have about 5,000 volunteers who are fighting and donating $50 and $100 to defeat Proposition 16. They have a handful of people whose buy-in is about $1 million, some putting in $2.5 million to get this across the finish line. We're fighting with fire here. And in a state such as ours, where it is hard to make the case that race is so insidious in our society that it warrants
30 seconds.
It warrants that affirmative action being used. There are a lot of people who are going to resist this. Resist it by no longer believing in the public institutions that we have. And so I would urge the board, your board, to understand the larger picture here. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So our next speaker will be Tom Campbell. Tom, please go ahead.
And just a quick reminder, you guys have about 10 minutes left for this organized presentation.
All right.
I think I'll take 1 minute. I was the dean of the business school at UC Berkeley from 2001 to 2007, 1 year leave of absence in the middle to be finance director of California. This was all under 209. We were rated the number 7 best business school in the country. And most importantly for today, number 6 best for minority recruitment of MBAs. That was the Wall Street Journal 2006 evaluation, number 6 in the country best. Year 209. What we did was to consider individual cases, recommendation for an MBA on the basis of her or his previous work, whether the person was the first in the family to go to college, what the income levels were. The circumstances were also improved by the efforts of our students. We had our undergraduates volunteered to go out into the Oakland school districts and meet with K through 12 high school students, pardon me, encouraging them to apply to UC. And we had our MBA students going to the community colleges to do the same. As a result of all of these efforts, we did not favor children of politicians. Acknowledged any reference to did you give money or did your parents contribute? We simply based it on each individual student's merit, but we didn't ignore the circumstances, including whatever racial situation might have brought the individual to apply to UC. And we came in number 6 in the entire country. So that's my experience, which may be relevant for your discussion later.
Thank you very much, Tom. Gail, please go ahead.
Okay, I think I just have one issue that I want to add, and that is many people think that Prop 16 is all about helping the disadvantaged, but I think the opposite is true. Let me remind you of the language. The state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, and public contracting. What you won't find there is anything that says that the state cannot grant a leg up to people based on things like low income. And thanks in part to Prop 209, the University of California does exactly that. It gives a little leg up to students who are low income, from low income neighborhoods, also whose parents didn't get a chance to go to college. Prop 209 just says you can't make a determination of who is disadvantaged based on race or sex. You know, we all know that there are African-American billionaires in California. There are female billionaires in California, and they're not disadvantaged. There are many members of the upper middle class who are from underrepresented minorities. And what Prop 209 says is that, you know, if you're going to grant a leg up to someone, it needs to be based on their individual circumstances. And there are many poor Asians in the state of California. There are poor whites in the state of California. And there are, of course, poor African Americans and Latinos. What Prop 209 has done is forces the university to focus on those metrics of disadvantage that are a lot more telling than race or sex. And I think that's a good thing, a very good thing. In the employment area, there's nothing that prevents the state of California from creating employment programs that benefit groups that have suffered disadvantage, as long as it's not defined in terms of race, sex, or ethnicity. So the chronically unemployed can get an advantage. And persons who have been incarcerated can be given a little leg up. All of that is possible and much to be preferred over defining disadvantage in terms of race and sex. I don't think anybody these days is naive that disadvantage is simply a matter of race or sex or ethnicity. And if we go back to the old ways, that's what's going to happen. The University of California cares about revenue, among other things, and they get a lot more revenue from upper middle class underrepresented students than they do from those who are low income. I hope it won't come to that. I hope that Prop 16 will be rejected.
All right, thank you very much, Gail. Professor Rick Sander.
Well, thanks very much for having me. So I'm a liberal Democrat with pretty good credentials on that line. And what matters to me in this debate is what makes sense in terms of promoting goals of greater social and racial equality. And I do a lot of research on higher education. And I've looked closely at the effects of Prop 209 at the University of California. I've published a couple of articles on on that topic. And I'm pretty bowled over by how successful as a social experiment Prop 209 was. What happened when Prop 209 went into effect at graduate schools in UC in 1997 and for undergraduates in 1998. And it prompted a soul searching and a new effort by the university to think through how they were diversifying the school. They couldn't simply use race anymore as kind of a way of achieving whatever racial goals they had on the campuses. So what they did is they launched the biggest effort at affirmative action in the university's history. It was all legal affirmative action. It was aimed at outreach towards underperforming schools, at building partnerships between different UC campuses and specific schools that were having difficulties, making sure that high school students had a better understanding of the A to G requirements at UC, creating, hosting programs, whole bunch of things. Well over $100 million were spent on these efforts, and they were incredibly successful. The number of Black applications to UC had been stagnant for 8 years before Prop 209 passed. In the decade after Prop 209 went into effect, Black applications tripled to UC. Hispanic applications quadrupled after a similar period of pre-209 flatness. What's even more striking is that the rate at which Blacks and Hispanics accepted offers from UC went up after Prop 209 went into effect. And research into that suggests that a lot of that was because minority students saw UC as a more appealing place to go, as sort of a uniquely appealing place to go, because of the absence of preferences and therefore the stigma attached to them attending. But even more important than these two effects were that outcomes went up dramatically for UC students from underrepresented groups.
30 seconds, Rick.
The 4-year graduation rate for Blacks tripled in the 15 years after Prop 209 went into effect, and it doubled for Hispanics. More students stuck with STEM fields. So in all these reasons, when you actually look at the facts, the record of Prop 209 is really impressive. It's been a successful experiment in helping Black and Hispanic students. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Rick. And then our last presenter is Frank Xu, our Assistant Treasurer. Frank, please go ahead.
I'm Frank Xu. I have been living in San Diego for 11 years and also a community volunteer. So I grew up in communist China, where the government has had absolute power over its people. And Proposition 16 would give California public agencies the power to discriminate against or give preferential treatment to some group of people over another based on race, sex, ethnicity, and country and region. So think twice. Should we, the people, give the government this kind of power to decide who should be favored and who should be discriminated against based on their race and gender? So Asian Americans from poorer backgrounds, Chinese restaurant workers, Indian gas station operators, Koreatown business owners, they will be scapegoated the most. So I always ask my kids, if they grow up knowing that they will not be favored because of their race, will they love more or hate more? So Proposition 16 is going to sow the seed of divisiveness, and it will only cause more problems from my firsthand experience. So I urge you vote no on Proposition 16. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Frank. And that's everybody from our side, and we welcome your questions.
We just had an interview this morning with advocates of the measure, and they were asked, why did they contend in their op-eds that this is not a zero-sum game, that some group isn't going to be hurt by this? And there was some concessions that, yes, people would be hurt by this, as opposed to this idea that this policy can somehow miraculously help everybody. But I would really be interested in hearing your response to that. Based on similar policies in college admissions, and not speaking to things like government contracts or hiring a faculty, we could see what we've seen at Wisconsin and in the Ivy Leagues, where Asian students are the victims of this. So my question is, ultimately, how does it make sense to punish Asian students for the sins of what many view as a racist white society?
I respond to that? I think you're right. The clear brunt of Prop 16, as far as UC is concerned, would fall on Asian American students. That's the group that the advocates see as being overrepresented, and by some analyses are overrepresented relative to their numbers in the high school population. We saw an indication of that at UCLA. UCLA has done some things that many observers think are violating Prop 209. There was an internal study commissioned by the chancellor that looked at admissions over a 5-year period, and it found that that through a new holistic procedure that had been adopted, the university was shifting many admissions places from Asian Americans to Blacks and Hispanics. Whites were kind of bystanders. The real folks who were negatively affected were Asian Americans. But the second point I want to make to your observation is that I think Prop 16 would actually be a negative sum game, not a zero sum game. And the reason for that is some of what I alluded to a moment ago, that after Prop 209 passed, when the university got rid of really large preferences, excuse me? Oh, maybe there's an echo. When the university got rid of really large preferences, African American and Hispanic performance improved really sharply. In the mid-1990s, the 4-year graduation rate for Blacks at UCLA was 15%, 1.5. And the ultimate graduation rate was something like in the mid-50s. Students were dropping out of STEM fields at very high rates. It was pretty unusual for an African American to enter UCLA and graduate with a STEM diploma. All those things changed when the university got rid of large racial preferences. So you had an increase in the numbers of graduates of all races, not only in absolute numbers, but in proportion to their entry levels. So that was a win-win. We managed to stop discriminating against whites and Asian Americans, and we also sharply improved the outcomes of Blacks and Hispanics. So I'm really concerned that if Prop 16 passes, we'll go back to using excessive racial preferences, largely out of political and student pressure, and that's going to depress the performance of Blacks and Hispanics again.
Can I add something here? And that is that the Brookings Institute has some numbers that I saw recently about the amount of time that high school students spend studying by race. And not surprisingly, Asian American students spend about twice as much time studying as white high school students, with Latinas being very close to whites and African Americans being lower. And going back to what Frank said, if you want to create, racial hard feelings, telling Asian Americans that studying harder will only get them discriminated against, I think it's a very sad story, and I hope we don't go down that path.
Early on the
we are risking total disorder in this state. Look at your demographics. Whites are fleeing the state. Middle class is shrinking. Black people are trying to become more self-reliant. You look at Candace Owens and others, they're talking about self-empowerment. Yet whites are saying, you can't say that. You're a victim. There are profound changes occurring in our country as a result of race, because of race. And we're standing in the way of that if we pass Proposition 16. It's a terrible thing to do.
Ward, you invoked Abraham Lincoln at the very beginning of this, but countries change, times change. Since May and the death of George Floyd, this country is having a long overdue racial reckoning. And when we met with the Yes side, Shirley Weber told a story of how she has a PhD and has gone on to do the things she has that have changed California for the better, because she was given a chance that she might not have gotten because of her skin color. So I guess my question for you is the Yes side says that this measure is needed because without it, there'll be changes kind of on the margins. minor improvements. But then in LA, city contracts, 95% go to white men. That if you can look at the UC system, the UC faculty, Asian American students in the classroom do not see Asian American students in front of them instructing them. So this is much broader than just student admissions. And I guess my question for one of you or a couple of you is, isn't this a moment when more needs to be done?
Let me try.
We should get back to our grounding, in my view. If we believe that there are problems in law enforcement, we should address them. Problems in law enforcement. But that does not suggest reordering our society. It does not suggest trying to bring in a system of representation and abandoning our commitment to equality, which is precisely what is happening. If you look at the bills that have been passed by the cadre of people promoting Prop 16, you will find measures that are part of a package, and that package is a total restructuring, transformation, as many of them call it, of the way we look at race. And I would suggest to you that what they're bringing in is going to set us back. It's going to make people feel that racial hostilities are greater than they actually are. It's going to dismember a lot of young Black people who are believing in themselves, and we're going to make them feel that they can't succeed in this nation. I think that many of those who say they're affirmative action products and they wouldn't be there absent affirmative action, that might have been the case 20 years ago. It is not the case now.
But isn't this, my understanding is that this is not a mandate and that this can't even be the determinative factor. It has to be one of several factors. So how do you say that in a city that is half Latino, like Los Angeles, that only 2% of the contracts, of the city contracts, go to Latinos?
Remember that part of the numbers are a little different from what you're thinking. It's not white males own all the businesses that are not minority owned. A lot of those businesses are not owned by any individual at all. So the majority, we're talking about companies that are even publicly traded. They're not white owned. They're owned by everybody. They're owned by everybody's retirement account. Going back to the issue that you were bringing up just a second ago, though, what I would like to say, it's true that this summer, there's been a lot of soul searching this summer. And there are some issues that are very important, as Ward was saying, that need to be resolved. What bothers me, and here I'm speaking, not just with Prop 16, but my work with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, all of this. Every time an issue comes up where the idea here is we need to help people that are really in need, people that really need help, somehow it gets twisted into a way to help the upper middle class. A good example is Prop 16 with its admissions issues, but an even better example is the legislature's new law requiring that racial minorities have a quota on boards of directors of publicly traded corporations. That is not going to go to members of the underclass. That is going to go to wildly successful people who are going to be asked to be on these boards of directors, but is not going to do a thing to solve the problems that actually are giving us trouble at this point. We really do need to do things in order to give the public greater confidence in law enforcement. There are a lot of things that need to be done, but they have nothing to do with having more upper middle class members at the University of California at Berkeley, as opposed to at the University of California at San Diego. And they certainly have nothing to do with who's going to be on the boards of directors of publicly traded corporations.
Let me jump back, please, for higher education just for a moment, because that's the field in which I have a little bit of background. I fear that the return to racial preferences is a shortcut, which will actually divert attention from improving the fundamentals of K through 12. Isn't it true that the fundamental problem is that the quality of education offered in lower income neighborhoods is appalling? And if instead, and therefore our efforts should be focused upon that, if instead, I use the word shortcut, you might get the following situation, and this comes from when I was a state senator on the Education Committee. We held hearings on affirmative action before Prop 209 was passed. And the vice president of the University of California system came and testified. I asked him, if we didn't offer preferences, where would the students whom you are admitting under these preferences go? And he said, oh, they'd be snapped up by Harvard and Yale. And I paused just for a moment to say, not addressing the problem. The problem is not that Harvard, Yale, and UC Berkeley, and UCLA, and UC San Diego are competing for the best qualified. It's that there are so terrible disadvantages in our system as to who gets those qualifications. So I'm worried that, just as I was told then in 1995, there would be a shortcut. We'll get the numbers right, and then we don't really need to focus, and probably won't, because it's much more difficult, the quality of high school and primary education.
Could I add a couple points as well, if that's all right? So speaking within the university, I can tell you that there is very, very strong pressure to do something that I think is indistinguishable from quotas if Prop 16 passes. There's just a lot of pressure from the state legislature and a lot of pressure from student groups and advocacy groups to achieve this sort of equal representation. And when you say that that Prop 16 will only allow race to be considered as one of many factors, there's nothing in the language that says that. That's simply a gloss that people are adding on based on the idea that federal law will restrict how aggressively racial preferences can be used. But in the Harvard case, the case that was mentioned earlier that revealed a lot of anti-Asian American discrimination, Harvard has had something that is completely indistinguishable from a quota. The last 3 years of their admissions process, the proportion of Black applicants who were admitted matched the proportion of non-Black applicants who were admitted down to the 100th of a percentage point. And Harvard said, oh, that's not a quota, that's just a goal. We're just factoring race in. And the federal district judge upheld that. So, it's simply not true that these things would not turn out to look like something indistinguishable from quotas. The second point is that at the UC, what we have learned is that when you get rid of preferences, you actually improve the pipeline. So not using large preferences for students means that Black and Hispanics are more likely to go on to graduate school to seek PhDs than they were before. The number of PhDs being admitted from UC undergraduate campuses to the UC graduate schools has increased. And their success rate once they're in those programs has increased. So if you look at the data on what's happened in UC post Prop 209, you see many, many more Black PhDs and many more Hispanic PhDs than before Prop 209. By any measure, if you just delve into the UC website, the Info Center website they have, it's just amazingly clear. And the explanation of that is that by using equal standards, you actually do a better job of building the pipeline.
Can I add something here? On the point of how large would preferences be, the Center for Equal Opportunity did a report about UC Berkeley's entering class. This was pre-Prop 209. And it has some data for you on just how large preferences were. And the answer is, this is definitely no gentle thumb on the scale. People like to say, well, it's just one factor. That doesn't mean it's not a huge factor. I mean, nothing is ever the sole determinant of who gets into a particular school. I mean, for example, you have to graduate from high school. You have to apply to get in. But it was a very, very large factor. The differences in credentials were hundreds of SAT score points and a large chunk of a GPA. This is really not a gentle thumb. This is a huge preference. And that's why the data show, as Rick was talking about, that it's such a large preference that it ends up actually interfering with the education of the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries, but end up actually getting the short end of the stick because somebody thought it would be a great idea to give them preferential treatment. Turns out.
Here's my last question. There's one of the most potent critiques of the Prop 16 that I've seen comes from people who point out California has refused to adopt K through 12 education reforms that have worked well in Texas, Florida, New Jersey, Massachusetts, New York. And so now, after the fact, they're trying to make up for the fact that they've delivered a subpar K through 12 education by bringing back racial preferences. And to me, that kind of is a powerful argument that gets to the point that state lawmakers are trying to kind of have a makeup call for the fact that they've refused to adopt reforms that have worked so well in other states. So I'd be interested to hear anyone's reaction to that.
I agree with part of that, but part I would disagree. I mean, after Prop 209 passed, there was a lot of attention, as I mentioned before, by UC on trying to improve K-12, especially 9 through 12. And there was also more attention by the state. It did kind of get people thinking about the pipeline issue. And one measure of what they achieved is that the Hispanic high school graduation rate went from 66% in 1997 to 88% in the most recent data that's available.
But the 2005 Harvard Civil Rights Project showed LA Unified lied about school district graduation rates forever. Why anyone trusts graduation rates after the 2005 Harvard study, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I hear what you're saying. So the data that I just quoted you is not from the school districts. It's from respondents to the census. It's people describing what their own educational level is. So that I think is a credible improvement, and it's a pretty dramatic improvement. At the same time, I totally agree that our whole discussion this year in an era where we have this great attention on racial inequality has been on what are often very silly kind of band-aid solutions that focus on outcomes and don't focus on the actual generators of racial inequality. My hobby horse in this area is racial segregation. There's just overwhelming evidence that if you lower levels of urban racial segregation, that gets at a whole bunch of root causes of racial inequality. And I would, for the added money we will spend on racially segmented contracting, that will cost the state a lot of extra money. If that money was put into programs to reduce housing segregation, you would have a much more dramatic impact upon the underlying problems.
Can I add something here? First, I wanted to point out that right after Prop 209, there was kind of a groundswell, as Rick was saying, and a good example of that is UC San Diego's Prus School, which seems to have had some good effects. Their focus there on bringing in students from disadvantaged backgrounds, not picking them by race, but nevertheless, bringing in disadvantaged students and giving them a better education than they would otherwise have gotten. I also agree that steam seems to have run out on that movement to improve K through 12, and that's a shame. And maybe if Prop 16 is defeated, as I hope it will be, there'll be more in that way. But I also wanted to add to what Rick said about putting money into K through 12. There is a study by Justin Marion, an economist at UC Santa Cruz, who found that Prop 209 on the public contracting side saved us, I think it was $63 or $64 million in a very short time period, a 2-year period in the late 90s. What he did is he studied the difference between two kinds of Caltrans contracts. Caltrans contracts that are paid for by state money and federal money where Prop 209 doesn't apply. And it was a great, laboratory case for making the comparison. And he found that the savings were quite substantial just for that little group of state-funded Caltrans contracts. If you then look at that over the course of Prop 209's lifetime up to 2020 and put it in 2020 dollars, that's about $1 billion. And if you then extrapolate from there to all the other kinds of public contracts that we have here in California. I mean, Caltrans is just a small swath of it. That's billions and billions of dollars. If that were put into improving education, that's a lot of money. Let me add as a footnote on the minority-owned businesses, what Justin Marion found is that it wasn't that these businesses weren't competitive, it's that they were concentrated in urban areas. And for Caltrans contracts, it meant that sometimes these businesses were having to do work on the far edges of the state where it was obviously going to be more expensive. They were doing work that was far away, because all the businesses in those areas wouldn't have qualified as women-owned or minority-owned. So again, it wasn't that these businesses were not competitive in their locations. They were. It's just that the state of California in these federally funded contracts was being forced to use businesses that were so far away that it was adding huge costs. And again, no reflection on the minority and women-owned businesses, but very expensive, and expensive to all taxpayers. That is, taxpayers of all races.
Anyone on the board want to jump in?
When we met with the proponents earlier, they did mention they have the NAACP, the ACLU, Black Lives Matter founders, there's athletes, there's celebrities who are all in favor of this proposition. What are they missing that you're trying to get out? Why are all these people saying the opposite?
You should look at it the other way around. We have the grassroots support, they don't. We have a campaign that is being funded by actual Californians. And they're given $50, they're giving $100, they're given $200, whereas they are being funded by very, very, very large entities. So why is it that the people are on our side and not on the side of celebrities? Well, I would submit that celebrities are not usually the people you want to rely upon when it comes to public policy issues. And so that's the question you should have asked them. Why is this simply something that is backed by organizations that get their funding by saying there are terrible race problems out there? Why aren't they getting their funding from actual individuals of all races? And I think the answer is obvious, that they have built themselves up this way as organizations that are going to live or die based on whether or not they can put all public policy issues in terms of race. And it's what I've been trying to say throughout this meeting, is that there's a whole lot more need for seeing things in terms of low income versus high income, advantaged versus disadvantaged on so many different dimensions. But they have founded these organizations by saying, well, the real issue is always race. Well, no, it's not. The real underlying issue is quite different. And so I would say that's why they do not have what we have, the volunteers who will walk through fire to make sure that Prop 16 doesn't pass. They don't have that. They have people that are on salary.
Yeah, to do it also, just to be clear real quick, Frank's given $10,000 and you, Gail, have given $30,000. So this
yeah, and guess what? I'm not rich. Let me.
Well, my point is, this isn't just people. It's not just everyone giving $50. There are some people who are giving large sums of money as well.
Yeah, we got the
hold on. Large sums of money compared to what? They're getting millions of dollars. The notion that a campaign whose highest funding level is $50,000 from the Students for Fair Admissions, that is chump change compared to what the typical campaign gets. The news there is not that No on 16 has large donations. It's very much, the opposite. And so I think that you need to be very, very clear on that, Frank, you have the exact percentages, but it wasn't something like over 90% of their money comes from donations that are larger than $100,000.
Yes, that's correct. So one donor donated 5.5 million to the yes side. And for the no side, we have more than 6,000 donors right now. And you know what? This question actually concerned me a lot because I have the experience living in a totalitarian country. If all the politicians and all the celebrities, and they advocate for the same thing, and they don't have the volunteers, and that's a problem. They might have some political gain to just advocate for the politicians. And that concerns me a lot because that makes me feel like I live in California's Republic of you know, and I know. So that's the issue.
I want to just add something though, because I think Laura is raising an important issue. You can, you know, Gail's right about, I think, the difference in how our campaigns are funded and the celebrity mindset and so on. But part of what I think Laura is alluding to is the fact that the UC regents have unanimously endorsed Prop 16. So why is that? You know, I'd really like to understand that better. And you know, I debated one of the regents on local public radio a week or two ago, and what was striking is that she was simply unacquainted with the facts that I mentioned during my short presentation at the beginning. She thought that UC applications from Blacks and Hispanics fell through the floor, and it's a funny phenomenon, but it's you know, it's partly that UC administrators were unanimously against Prop 209, and I think were reluctant to change their position. Found it politically difficult to change their position when the evidence started coming in the other way. There's been a tendency in the media to focus on the fact that enrollment levels of Blacks dropped at Berkeley and UCLA, even in the midst of all these other positive trends I've been talking about. And the reason why Berkeley and UCLA had those drops is because they were sort of concentrating all the Blacks. 50% of the Blacks at UC were at those two campuses before Prop 209. There were sort of segregation of Blacks at the top schools. So I think there's been a media failure and a UC leadership failure that has just really created this myth that that Prop 209 hurt racial minorities, and they haven't bothered to look at the facts. There hasn't been an attempt. The regents, for example, did not bring in people like me to sort of have a debate in front of them, just sort of hear what different perspectives were saying. There's a bubble where they just sort of repeat this same false story narrative over and over again. And I think that sort of explains why we have this groupthink at the top.
Is it accurate to call it false? There's a UC Berkeley study I'm sure you're familiar with, got a lot of news coverage in August, that showed that the ban on affirmative action significantly harmed Black and Latino students by reducing their enrollment across UC campuses, lowering their graduation rates and driving down subsequent wages.
Yeah, if there's a way to send you some stuff after we're finished, I'd love to send you my.
We've actually sent that along, so.
Okay. So you've probably seen that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the author
after
of that
the meeting, we will send again some of including this contracting study that Gail mentioned earlier, as well as some information on our small dollar donors.
But again, is it a false narrative, or is it a false narrative, or are there two sides in a campaign?
Yeah, let me just give you the capsule summary. Zachary Bleemer is the author of that. He's a graduate student at Berkeley. He was using secret data that he won't let anyone else look at, and the university won't let anyone else look at. But the few things in his article that can be checked are clearly false. He claims, and if you read the first line of his conclusion, he says, well, after Prop 209, minority enrollments fell by 800 students per year. That's false. It actually, there was a very small dip, much less than 800 students the first year, and then it went up and up and up and up. So that's a demonstrably false claim, and it's central to his whole argument, because he's sort of saying there are all these people who didn't get into UC, and let's track what happened to them where they ended up going. But the reality is that many more underrepresented minorities didn't go to UC. So the Bleemer article is not only based on secret data, but demonstrably wrong.
Let me add a little bit here, and that is that, you know, I have read Rick's response to the Bleemer study, and I thought it was devastating. But what bothered me is the New York Times publishes an article written by a student that is not peer-reviewed and is based on secret data. But when studies by Rick Sander, by Peter Arcidiacono in particular, since the Arcidiacono article dealt with Prop 209 specifically, many studies that the New York Times didn't seem to think was newsworthy, when they were in fact written by tenured faculty members at distinguished institutions and were peer-reviewed, and yet they didn't make it into the news. And this student piece that is not peer-reviewed, and as Rick has pointed out, insofar as you can check the data, it's demonstrably false. That really says a lot about what gets in newspapers these days.
And also,
Well, to be clear, you mentioned the New York, not to get off on a side note, but you mentioned the New York Times. I think that criticism is directed towards the New York Times.
Oh, yes.
If you have criticism of our newspaper, I'm glad to hear it, but let's not paint the media with a broad brush. Thanks. Frank.
I want to add one more point. I put on the chat regarding the question. So the Yes site, they put a fact on their website. I put the link there. The facts, they say the fact is a few wealthy donors are trying to use race to divide us. So
well, I encourage all of you to do a search and look up some op-eds that we recently ran by some administrators at UCSD who we didn't ask them to write these. They just came in talking about the African-American enrollment and how horrible it was, and that the whole institution needs to do better. So I encourage you to just take a look at those because it might shed some light on information that you might not know about, and definitely opinions from their side. And I also just wanted to mention, since you did about grassroots, I think that there's a lot of people who've been involved in the Black Lives Matter movement who are grassroots and should not be disregarded as being, you know, high funders of something. There are a lot of grassroots people that have gotten involved in that movement.
I would suggest to you that as you talk about, as all of us talk about the high profile endorsements and the like, that we remember that California is a one-party state, political party state. And if you understand anything at all about the Board of Regents and how it operates, when that party calls and says, we're going to put this on the ballot, we'd like your support, all of the troops start lining up to support what the party wants to do. The same thing applies to other parts of this political machine that has been built in California. I don't say that to demonize them or to be ad hominem, but that is the reality. And you can create your own echo chamber if you control the party. You can influence a lot of people who will endorse. Moreover, it has always been the case in every one of the 10 states that I've been involved in that this is a circumstance of the people versus the establishment.
Let me ask you about the people. There's a poll out, the PPIC poll, there are other polls as well, but that one shows about a third of the public supports this measure. More than almost half, 47% of the PPIC poll oppose it, and there's 20% undecided. So I guess my message for you is, what's your message to the undecided?
What kind of a state do you want to live in? One where the government decides whether your kids go to quit school, your kids go to, who gets a job, who gets a contract on the basis of race? Or do you want a state where people are urged to go out and work as hard as they can and to be accepted on the basis of their own merit and to have faith in the institutions, their public institutions, that they will be treated fairly without regard to their race or circumstances that they can't control at birth?
I would like to put it myself in one other way. Is it, to the undecideds, is it right to keep a student out of the university, college, University of California, because of that person's race? Because as we began, that is the fact. There is a zero sum. So maybe there are arguments that it is worthwhile that an individual assembly member had an advantage, as she mentioned. Is it worth it? Is it something that we want our society, our state of California, to do? Will you look somebody in the eye and say, I choose to keep you from the University of California to which you would otherwise be admitted because of your race? When you ask that question, it's a fair question. I do not believe you will get very many undecided saying, yes, I would do that.
You mentioned other states, or you mentioned California. 42 states, as I understand it, have something similar to what California would have, allowing affirmative action. Why is this on a state level nationally? Why do people see it the other way than you all?
I don't think they do. I think that it's simply we are lucky enough to have a system of direct democracy so that people can speak. Whereas in those other states, they have no mechanism. But my suspicion is that if you were to put that question anywhere in the country, no, we're not exactly considered a conservative state here in California, and yet, at least according to the poll that you cited, and also the Berkeley poll, most people seem to be against this. If you look at the polling that Gallup does, they ask, I think, a very fair question where they put out the arguments on both sides, and 2-to-1 on the issue of college admissions. Americans of all races, I might add, do not favor racial preferences in admissions, even when it's explained to them that this is something that could help diversity. And so I think the only reason that these things haven't gone out to every state is that most states don't have a direct democracy mechanism, and that's important here. Legislators like to have the discretion to discriminate. If that's the thing about politicians, that's the thing about the heads of universities. If you tell them, hey, I'll give you more power, they're going to tend to be in favor of it. Whereas the average voter wants to limit the discretion of people in those positions. So that, I think, is the difference.
Let me just add 2 quick points. One is that if you look at, one of the areas where mismatch is a big problem, as I mentioned, is African Americans sticking with STEM fields, science and math fields. So if you look at the proportion of Black college graduates going on to graduate school in STEM fields or achieving STEM degrees, it's been very flat nationally or slightly declining for the last 15 years. At UC, it's been dramatically increasing. So we have benefited from having this different type of regime. We're doing better than the rest of the country on a whole host of measures. The second thing I want to mention is I just pulled up while we were talking the UC San Diego numbers, since UC San Diego was specifically brought up. So in 1997, the last year of racial preferences, UC San Diego had 63 African American freshman enrollees. In 2019, they had 179, about 3 times as many. The student campus body had increased during that time too, but the African American increase was about double the overall percentage. The number of Hispanics rose from 338 to 1,432. And if I had time, I would pull up the graduation numbers. But not only has there been a dramatic increase in minority representation, but those students are also having much better outcomes than they did before Prop 209.
All the issues about which you can fault California, this one is probably the most hypocritical. California never follows. It always prides itself on leading. I remember when my wife and I married back in 1962, most parts of the state, interracial marriages were not allowed. Nobody faulted or nobody complained that I know of from my side of the equation that was the wrong thing to do. California leads, and in the fullness of time on this issue, California's position of equality will be vindicated. I have no doubt.
My clock just hit noon, so I think that's a good note to end on. I appreciate all your time. If we have more questions, we will reach out to you. I guess one last point, is there any issues we didn't cover that you want to quickly bring up, or did we cover everything you needed?
I think you've covered it very well, and we're grateful for your time.
No, thank you for the discussion.
Okay.
But I pray that you'll do the right thing and lead on it, not follow.
Thank you. Thank you, Ward and Richard and Gail and Frank.
Thank you.
I appreciate the time today.
Very nice meeting you all.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you.